Okay, we are now live on Facebook.
Oh, shit now.
Okay, we're good to start.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Duffy. I am a collaborative writer, story development coach, broadcast journalist, and proud host of the Backstory on KBLA Talk 1580 here in Los Angeles, California. I am delighted to serve as the moderator for this evening's town hall. Something else you all should know about me is Baltimore, Maryland is home and where I spent the first 50 years of my life prior to relocating here in Los Angeles. So again, I am honored to be a part of tonight's conversation. Before introducing our panelists, allow me to welcome everyone to the Collective Groups Forum on the Legislation of Cannabis. As you all know, the legislation of cannabis is one of the most high-profile issues on the ballot in Maryland's gubernatorial election this year. And here's why. It asks the question, do you favor the legislation and the use of cannabis by an individual who is at least 21 years of age? That's a mouthful. That's a big deal. If approved, this legislation will go into effect July 1st, 2023, and Maryland will join 19 other states to include Washington, D.C. as states that allow cannabis to be used for recreational use. During this evening forum, we will discuss what this piece of legislation will mean to Black and Brown communities in Maryland. That said, let's now meet our panelists for the evening. First, we have Gabriel Acevedo, who represents District 39 in Montgomery County, which is one of the largest counties in Maryland. Originally from Trinidad, Delegate Acevedo is the first openly gay Afro-Latino and one of the youngest people elected to the Maryland House of Delegates. He serves on the House Appropriations Committee, Administration Subcommittee, Oversight Committee on Pensions, Work Group to address police reform and accountability in Maryland. He served as the second vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, treasurer of the Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus, and is a member of the Maryland Legislative Transit Caucus. Thank you, Delegate Acevedo, for being with us this evening and for being a champion for equity. Welcome. Our next panelist is Mr. Kevin Ford Jr., the Executive Director of Uplift Maryland, a nonprofit that advocates for restorative justice to families and communities who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs. Kevin is a native of Prince George's County and a Morehouse grad. Kevin is a medical cannabis patient who noticed a void in the marketplace for a clear source of information for cannabis users, and from that formed Uplift Maryland, a one-stop shop for navigating the state's cannabis industry. Uplift Maryland is one of 5 companies awarded a grant from the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission to develop and implement a business development and training program for minorities and women who wanted to apply for a grower and processor license in Maryland. Thank you so much, Kevin, for being with us this evening. We are excited to have you join us as a cannabis advocate. Our final panelist this evening is Hope Wiseman. Hope is a native of Prince George's County who has always been passionate about serving her community. In 2014, Hope graduated with an economics degree from the illustrious Spelman College. After spending a year at Sunset Trust as an equity institutional sales analyst, Hope decided to continue striving for excellence by pursuing her dreams of entrepreneurship. In the fall of 2017, Hope Wiseman became the youngest Black woman dispensary owner in the United States with the opening of Marion, Maine, amen, and Prince George's County. Hope has been featured in Black Enterprise, Huffington Post, and more publications. Hope also uses her time to speak and consult as a means by which to empower others looking to enter the cannabis industry. Welcome, panelists. We thank you again for your presence here today. Let's get right into it. I want to first start with Delegate Acevedo. As our political giant tonight, would you briefly explain question 4 and how it actually ended up on the ballot in Maryland?
Well, good evening, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. I want to first thank all of the organizers and the individuals who were a part of making tonight's discussion possible. I'm really excited to hear from my fellow co-panelists as we sort of delve into and unpack not just cannabis legalization, but what question 4 means for our community, but also the work that we still need to do, because there is still work that we need to do in this particular space. As was mentioned, I'm Delegate Gabriel Acevedo, and I'm proud to represent Maryland's 39th House District, which is the northwestern part of Montgomery County. This year,
Can I interrupt you really quickly? Can I just, in terms of laying the groundwork, can I just say that, one, we're going to give you 3 to 4 minutes to answer the question. And if we all could just honor the time so that we can get as many questions in as possible and have the best conversation, because we're also going to take questions from the audience at some point. All right. So let's just manage ourselves in terms of time. But thank you so much for being here. And I apologize for the interruption.
So yeah, just prior to this question 4 being on the ballot this November, I've been advocating in this space. I've actually introduced legislation related to cannabis legalization, and I encourage folks to take a look at House Bill 1342-1342. It's the Cannabis Legalization and Equity Act that, among other things, legalizes cannabis, but also addresses some of the concerns that I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit more about this evening. But what we ultimately, and by we, I mean the Maryland General Assembly, the state legislature, did this year was we passed 2 important pieces of legislation. The first is House Bill 1, which later became the question 4 initiative. So when you go to vote on November 8th, or if you early vote, and I encourage folks to do that, you will see question 4 on your ballot that essentially allows you as Marylanders, the voter, to decide whether or not we should legalize recreational cannabis in this state. Once that happens, there is another triggering piece of legislation, because there were 2 pieces of legislation that was passed earlier this year by the Maryland General Assembly. The first is House Bill 1, and the second is House Bill 837. And essentially, 837 is a triggering legislation, which means that when the people of Maryland vote to legalize cannabis, and I'm confident that we will do that because that's where the public opinion polls are sort of, directing and showing us that this is something that will pass. What will happen after that is that triggering piece of legislation would create a number of things. One, it would allow for expungement, albeit not automatic expungement. So in other words, you still have to do the administrative paperwork. You still have to go through all of the exercises of getting your record expunged. It creates a community reinvestment fund. It also allows for certain regulations around healthcare, et cetera. And so these two pieces of legislation are particularly important when we think of the topic of cannabis legalization, but more immediately, what you're going to see on your ballot this November 8th is question 4 that legalizes adult recreational cannabis. And that other triggering piece of legislation, which I'm happy to talk about some more as we get into the conversation, is really, in my opinion, represents not just the work that we did, but the work that we didn't do as it relates to cannabis legalization.
Wow, wow. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. Having said that, Kevin, I want to bring you into the conversation from a medical cannabis patient and advocate perspective. How important has Uplift Maryland been in this process with respect to working on the question, getting it on the ballot, or convincing voters to vote yes to it?
Appreciate you having me. And also I'll be remiss if I didn't bring greetings from my chapter, Gamma Pi chapter of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, under the leadership of Boston's brother, Richard Allison. So Uplift Maryland, we started off as really more so a one-stop shop for anyone who was looking to get into the cannabis industry, whether as a patient, a caregiver, or a provider who was actually doing the medical certifications. And the whole process that we went through was more so going from registration to education, and then now to advocacy and lobbying. So over the past couple of years, we've been very loud, I would say, about making sure that we move forward with legalization. Back in 2019, 2018, and even 2015, when Hope won her license, it was shown through a disparity study that Black folks were not as involved in the industry as we should be. And so from that point forward, when I realized that, we made sure that we were pushing for legalization, whether through legislation through the actual legislative session, or putting it on the ballot. I think after a while, it became clear that, you know, the legislature wasn't going to move forward through legislation. So we started advocating for putting it on the ballot, not only because we were confident that Maryland voters were going to come and vote for it, but also as a get out the vote tool for the right candidates to get in office. And I won't necessarily say a specific party because we're a nonpartisan organization. But I know it's important for us to all really just look at legalization from the standpoint of not necessarily a commodity or from the consumption aspect, but really looking at this from the criminal justice reform aspect first, and ensuring that folks in our communities are no longer subjectively and overly policed and arrested and taken to jail or even incarcerated over this plant. So I think that was the main fight for us.
So can I ask you, what role has your organization played to that end with the criminal justice reform aspect of it?
So, I mean, right now it's more so just trying to get folks out to vote. And using a lot of grassroots efforts, from text messaging to social media advertisements, to just get folks to the polls. There was a recent poll that was shown that came out from Washington Post and the University of Maryland that showed that support in the mostly Black jurisdictions, being Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Charles County, and Prince George's County, really was extremely high. But one thing that we know about Black voters, and we also know about young voters who were very likely oversampled within that poll, is that that's not your traditional voter base. So I think that you need somebody who speaks their language to come out and say, hey, look, this is not something that we need to sit on the sideline for, but we need to get active and get involved and make sure we get out here and vote. And then once we do vote and it passes, doing the hard work after the fact to ensure that folks who look like us have a seat at the table and a chance at these opportunities.
Great, thank you for that. And Hope, let's have you join us in this wonderful conversation. As a cannabis dispensary operator, what challenges have you dealt with or concerns do you have relative to question 4?
Well, I feel like question 4 is, the beginning of what Maryland can do in this industry. So I don't necessarily have When it comes to my business, honestly, question 4 by itself lets me know something that I've always known was going to happen, that cannabis is going to be legal in Maryland at some point, and at some point I will be able to make adult use sales from my store. What that will look like, question 4 has nothing to do with that. So me as a business owner, from that perspective, you know, it's a moot point now. Me as an advocate and me as someone that deeply cares about this industry, and as somebody that wants to be a part of making sure that we right the wrongs of the war on drugs, I think that it's important to realize that question 4 still leaves some holes in the criminal justice reform that we need to see. That being said, I still want everybody to vote yes. I'm not, you know, one of those people that's like, if it's not perfect, we shouldn't move forward. But there are definitely some holes that we're gonna have to address in the legislative session. It decriminalizes cannabis at the smallest levels, but there's still opportunities for people to be criminalized because of this plant, even when we vote yes. So I think that's something as an advocate that I want people to know. At the same time, I still think we need to all go out, vote yes for this. It's the first step to taking this plant out of a dangerous area.
Amen. Can I ask you, Delegate Acevedo, how confident are you about the yeses that this is going to pass?
I feel pretty confident, and that's not, you know, because of public opinion polls, but I think if we look at where Maryland is as a state and on a number of these issues, I have faith in Marylanders that we will do the right thing to not just end the criminalization of cannabis, but we're doing our part as a state that incarcerates more Black people between the ages of 18 and 35 than any other state in the union. And yes, that's Maryland. And it's according to not just a recent justice policy studies, but some of the information that we're also getting back. We are still a state, despite all of the policies that we've looked at and implemented. There's so much more work that we need to do. And I would argue that this referendum question 4 is yet another action taken by us, not just as a state legislature, but this is an opportunity for Marylanders to take action to say that, 1, we will no longer be a state that incarcerates more Black people between the ages of 18 and 35 than any other state in the union, and recognizing that the racist and intentional war on drugs has certainly contributed to that mass incarceration, not just in Maryland, but, you know, when we think about the United States as a country, right, we incarcerate more people than we do a number of countries that we criticize for human rights violations. And so while I feel confident that this is something that's going to pass, I also recognize that there's a lot of educating that needs to take place. I think there's a generational divide when we talk about cannabis legalization or even cannabis use. You know, I'm not just a state legislator, I'm not just an advocate, but I'm also a patient. And that's something that I think it's important when we have these conversations to lean in, because we as a community need to not just understand the medicinal benefits, but regardless of where you fall on this issue, we can all agree that our communities have and continue to be disproportionately impacted. And for me, voting for question 4 is harm reduction.
Okay, I was about to say, that's your time. Thank you for that. All right, Kevin, how would the legalization of marijuana open doors to economic benefits and or opportunities to Black and brown people from your perspective?
Well, I would start off by saying that it could open doors. Okay. And right now, it's not clear whether or not those doors are actually going to be open, and which is the main reason why we're in the fight that we're in, to ensure that Black and brown business owners have an opportunity to not only enter the market, but also sustain within the market. So that's why we're pushing for equal opportunity for actual business opportunities, but then also equitable resources for businesses to be able to sustain as well.
And what, in your opinion, does the equitable resources look like?
I mean, it could look like low to no interest loans. It could look like guarantees on loans from private financing institutions. It could look like it could look like a few things. It could look like franchising. It could look like ensuring that the current licensees give branding opportunities to folks who are within our communities who have been a part of this legacy market for a number of years. I think there's a number of different possibilities and solutions for equitable resources. I think that that's just on us to all come together and get on the same page and make a decision.
Hope, how do you feel about what Kevin just said? Does that make sense to you? And from your perspective, what does the resource piece look like? And how could you potentially play a part?
Totally. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've had the opportunity, I've been in this industry for a while now. I began to pursue the license in 2014, applied in 2015, won it in 2016, opened the store 2018. And during that time, I have worked on other applications in plenty of other states, been a part of teams, written for other people. So I've gotten to learn and see a lot over all these years. And, I think that the biggest barrier to entry, especially in a competitive licensing process, is when you're going through this process, if it's competitive and you're competing against someone who has a lot more money than you, they're going to be able to include resources that you just can't, let's say if you have to turn in a site plan, they can afford to go out and get full MEP drawings of their building and, have this elaborate site plan that might cost $200,000 or $300,000. And that's just not something that you would be willing to put money up and be at risk versus a multi-million-dollar company that, is pretty sure with strong political connections and lobbyists and all these things. I think that states are getting smarter though. Every process that comes out prioritizes equity a little bit more. And I think that Maryland will get it right. We've already been under fire for not having enough diversity in the industry, and we don't want that again. So I do expect for this process to be as pretty equitable, but I will say, if there is a cap on licenses, no matter what, you create competition. Competition means someone's going to spend money. I like to say competitive licensing processes are like a test that's graded on a bell curve, an open book test that's graded on a bell curve. So you and me can write the same thing, same exact thing, but either I'm going to get the higher score or you. And that might be based off of something very small, a person I have on my team, or maybe we were able to raise more money than you and prove it, or whatever it might be. So I think we just have to look at how we structure the program, and we have a lot of examples. We'd be state number 20 to do this. So we know what works and what doesn't work.
Hope, do you currently know the cost of getting a license?
Well, the cost of, the actual physical cost of putting in an application is usually not much, in New Jersey, for example, that's one that's going on right now. That process it's like $800 to anywhere between $800 to $5,000. I think Maryland was like $5,000 before. It's the things that goes into writing an application that costs money. If you have to secure real estate, if you're hiring lawyers, if you're hiring consultants, if you have to go out and get drawings done, if you have to secure any vendors, or if you have to hire any subject matter experts. Let's say you're going after a cultivation license and you've never even grown a tomato. You probably have to go out and find someone that has, and you potentially will have to pay them to be a part of your team.
Gotcha.
So yeah, it could cost you anywhere between a couple thousand to a couple $100,000.
Wow. Delegate Isavero, based on what you've heard Kevin and Hope say, I know the first priority is getting the bill passed, right? But then can we also talk about how will the state work to ensure equity in issuing grower and operator license in Maryland?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think two things to mention about that. One is, again, coming back to my bill, House Bill 1342, the Cannabis Legalization and Equity Act. But also, two, this is something that I've been hopping on for a very long time, especially after, as a state, we legalized medical cannabis in Maryland. And essentially, what we have now in Maryland in our medical cannabis industry is an industry that is owned and operated largely by people who do not live in this state, companies that aren't situated in this state, but people who do not look like the people languishing behind bars. That is the medical cannabis industry, and in part, it looks the way it does because equity was not was something that was not prioritized, and despite the disparity studies that have been done, what the legislature, because I wasn't elected to the legislature at the time, but what the legislature didn't do was prioritize equity, and instead attempt to deal with the issue of equity on the back end when the ship had already been, had already sailed, so to speak. And so this is something that we have to deal with on the front end. And earlier, when I mentioned the legislature passed two bills, House Bill 1 and House Bill 837, I voted for House Bill 1 that essentially created a referendum for Marylanders to vote on. And I voted against House Bill 837. And I made it very clear on the House floor why it is that I was not just voting against this piece of legislation, but concerns that I'd raised every single step of the way that I believe were not addressed. And that is, we were not prioritizing the communities most impacted. And a lot of people are throwing around these buzzwords, these social justice buzzwords, like, equity and equitable and what works for communities most impacted. And we have to understand what that means to us first, so that when these bills come down the pipeline, we're not just accepting other people's definition of equity, but we're understanding it as understanding equity as you're not making things all things equal, but you're doing that, but you're also taking into consideration the fact that some communities have been left behind, some communities have been disproportionately impacted, and what does investment look like to ensure that we're making them whole. But also when we talk about equity and licensure, because that's also another issue. And I'm glad to see Hope on the call. Marion, Maine, I've gone to that dispensary and I've gone back many times, but the reality of it is we don't have too many Marion, Maines, and in part because of our licensure process and the factors that go into determining who gets a license. I think we can learn from a lot of other states that have gone down this road. One conversation I've been hosting is cannabis conversations with other state legislatures in states where cannabis is either criminalized, where it is decriminalized, or whether recreational cannabis is fully legalized. And the whole point about that is that we should learn from these other states, particularly around equity, particularly around, ensuring that, those who want to are able to get into this industry. And it doesn't seem like we're learning that as yet. And so I voted against House Bill 837 for a number of reasons. One, while we allowed for expungement, it was not automatic expungement. As I said earlier, you're then forcing people to go through the process of doing the administrative paperwork, paying the filing fee, getting an attorney, et cetera, when automatic expungement has to be a part of our reparative justice plan. Secondly is equity, again, as I said, in licensure. What kind of a system do we have? What is the point system that we're looking at to determine who gets a license? Who's Black, who's Latino, who's veteran? What does that mean in terms of points and how much points it would take in order to get a recreational cannabis license, right? The third thing is around criminal justice. We are legalizing and we are not decarcerating every single person that is in our state penitentiary or jails for cannabis possession with intent to distribute, majority of whom are Black and brown, need to be set free. You probably have seen Biden recently took federal action to, deal with clemency, et cetera, and he called on state governors to do the same.
Got you. Thank you for that. We're going to come back to that. I want everyone to take a shot at this next question. In your opinion, from your perspective, from your perch, how will communities of color, underserved communities in particular, benefit from the passage of this legislation? I know you all have thrown some things out, but if you could just kind of more circumspectly speak to that.
So we have the opportunity for expungement. It's going to create what they call it, a community a cannabis assistance fund. I don't think that what the supporting legislation addresses much about what they're going to do to directly benefit the communities affected. So I believe that that's something that will happen next legislative session, where they'll talk about the tax revenue and how it's going to be distributed. And that's going to be something huge that social equity advocates, and I'd assume pretty much everyone on this call is going to be fighting for, to make sure that the money is allocated in a way that makes sense, that's allocated to go back to the communities. Social equity is about more than just licensure. Like we really want to see people whose families and communities were ripped apart. We want to see them made as whole as they could be at this point. So yeah, I know that that's a focus of mine going into legislative session.
Got you. Again, thank you to our audience for being here. If you have questions, please write them down, because we are going to go to a point of taking questions in a few moments. Kevin, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so Delegate Acevero just spoke about criminal justice reform, and then Hope just talked about economic opportunity. But I think one other thing that is important that will come from a legalized industry is really safe and affordable access. Right now, we have a very hefty legacy market in which folks have, again, been within this industry for years. But one thing about the legacy market is that those products aren't lab tested. So we're not really sure, what all is in them. And I just know that the comfortability that I feel also as a medical patient getting my cannabis from an actual dispensary where I know exactly what's in it and what's not. And I think also from the affordability standpoint, I think legalizing and hopefully if we are able to go in a more equitable route, that will also be able to drop the price for patients or consumers as well, which would essentially eliminate the legacy market, and hopefully, again, through the equity aspect, bringing those people into the fold rather than shunning them away from the opportunities as well is very is pertinent.
Amen. And Delegate Acevero, what are your thoughts about how it will most benefit brown and Black communities?
Everything that was just mentioned. I think Hope and I'm sorry, I see at K Ford. I apologize, but I think Brother Ford is also right in that from a criminal justice aspect, I think more so economic empowerment. Again, we are a community that have been locked up for participating in this underground economy, because that's exactly what it is right now. It's an underground economy. And I think as we bring this economy to the light of day, what is critical, what is very important is that we also have a pathway for those who have been incarcerated into the industry. We also have opportunities for Black folks to be able to participate, and for there to be more Marion Mains, for there to be more Hope Wisemans, and for that kind of a participation to be something that's, again, baked in. So there's benefits to it. And of course, I would like to see where the resources, or in other words, oof.
Is that you, Delegate?
No, that's not me.
No.
But also to see where that money is going to go, because medical cannabis was projected by the state to make $40-something million in the first fiscal year. It ended up making $90-something million. And I think we're talking about recreational cannabis here and the kind of a money that's going to be coming into the state coffers. So part of reparative justice is saying, look, this burgeoning billion-dollar industry, the revenues that we get from that, are we ensuring that we're investing it in the right communities and in the right ways? And we're allowing communities to have greater control, and we're not just patronizing them. And that's important. Don't just create a fund and say we're going to give it this, give this amount of money to this cause, etc. But do communities have control over where those investments are going and what it is being invested in?
Okay. Awesome. I'm not sure where that background noise is coming from, but if you are not a panelist, could you please mute your line, because it is very, very disruptive. Also want to ask the question, this is going to be for Delegate Maryland has several federal employees who live in, all right, when they say that Maryland has several federal employees who live in Maryland but work in DC, right? As a federal employee, you are prohibited from owning a cannabis business or even growing marijuana. With the passage of question 4, how does that affect a large portion of the minority government workforce? And is that a question that you've been thinking about?
I mean, this is a question in American government, right? Supremacy clause. While we are a state, Maryland is a state, and we are able to make laws that that govern our state. We are also one of 50 states in the United States, and the laws that Congress and that the executive branch at the federal level pass or enact are the laws of the land. And so folks should govern themselves accordingly and make sure that they're educating themselves, not just on state law, but on federal law as well. But going back to what I said earlier about President Biden and the recent announcement that he made, starting the process to reschedule cannabis. And this is particularly important because cannabis right now is a Schedule I drug, and that has implications not just for the criminalization and enforcement, but also the industry side of it, right? And so the fact that there is some action being taken by the Biden administration to not just reschedule marijuana, to ensure that they are granting clemency. And he also called on state governors to do the same for those who currently have charges in these states. I think it's an example of why we need action at the federal level, as well as action at the state level. What we've seen is states taking the lead on cannabis legalization, decriminalization, et cetera. And that is something that we should applaud, but we also need action at the federal level as well to match what states are doing so that people aren't confused, right? To your point.
How is that going so far? How is that collaboration from the state and federal level going so far?
I think so there's a number of federal officials who have introduced cannabis legalization legislation. I don't think any of them have gotten a hearing as yet, whereas in Maryland, every bill that's introduced in the state legislature is guaranteed a hearing. So I don't see much traction on cannabis legalization at the federal level outside of what President Obama announced a few weeks ago on what his administration is going to be doing around cannabis. But what I do see is a lot of action at the state level to ensure that we're doing our part to end our contribution to the racist drug war, to ensure that we're reinvesting back in communities. And I'm asking folks to pay attention and to not assume that folks are going to do the right thing. This is our second and last bite at the cannabis apple, because the first time was medical cannabis, and we saw what came of that when it came to equity, licensure, and participation of minority folks in this industry. We have one last bite of this apple. We need to ensure that we're prioritizing freeing folks. We need to ensure that it's a clear-cut licensure process, and how many points are going to go towards what. We need to ensure that we're providing also other incentives. Mr. Ford mentioned it earlier about the incentives that we're providing to folks to participate in this issue. Capital is a serious issue, right? And it's a barrier for us participating in this industry. So much things that we need to do, but I think starting there is a good way to go.
Kevin, can we talk about, you mentioned the education and lobbying a few moments ago. Can you talk about the biggest part of educating the public that Uplift Maryland has had to do? Talk to us about that, what that education part looks like, and what part you feel people are getting and what part you feel people are struggling with.
I think that I'm gonna start with the end of the question first. I think what people are struggling with is honestly PTSD. The Black community has been traumatized by cannabis legalization, and we're seeing that effect, and primarily within our largest group of voters, which is women, but also Black women in our community over the age of 40, I think 47, I believe it is.
So unpack what you mean when you say that we're dealing with PTSD around the legalization of cannabis.
So, I mean, just from the criminalization and what we've seen from the war on drugs and the way
Yeah.
that it's impacted our communities and our families in our communities, as Hope stated earlier, it's really about making sure that we are empowering families to be the best that they can be rather than trying to break them down, which has been really the entire mission of the criminal justice system, it seemed like, over the course of generations. And when you look at the way that cannabis was first made illegal back in 1937, it was extremely racially motivated. And then even the war on drugs was racially motivated with the different minimum sentences and things that were going on. So we're just really at a place right now, as Delegate Acevedo said, where we have an opportunity, and we have to act now on this opportunity to make sure that this thing is not only legalized, but legalized right.
Yeah, legalized right sounds like the most important part of it. Hope, you mentioned that there are still some loopholes, right? That there's still some holes that you're concerned about. Can you talk to us about one or two of the holes that you're concerned about?
Yeah, so and this is in reference to that companion bill that gets enacted once the referendum passes. So this is Bill 837.
Okay.
I think the biggest hole for me is on the criminal justice side, right? So, the delegate already talked about how there's no automatic expungement. That's a problem. There's going to be a lot of people that, one, don't even realize that this is happening. Two, don't have the resources, or just simply they're just not going to go through the process. People don't seem to like to have to go through the system. But also we got home grow in there, so that's exciting. We get to grow 2 plants, which most other states that have home grow have a little bit more. So I think we'd like to, see that increased a little bit. Even our neighbors in DC can grow 6 plants a person, and you can have up to 12 in a household. So, we're kind of behind there. But I think the biggest hole for me is, and they specifically have language about you making brownies in your own home. And I think you could be arrested and jailed for up to 6 months or something like that, or 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. It's like $5,000 fine for making brownies in your own home. Wow. And I would bet there's even somebody on this call right now that makes brownies in their house today. So, yeah. So, if it's not you guys. So, yeah, that's a big problem for me. Also, it decriminalizes possession up to 1.5 ounces, right? Mm-hmm. You can buy more than 1.5 ounces right now at a dispensary if you have a medical card. So what happens if I'm caught with more than that, even if I got it from the dispensary? Technically, if it's under 2.5 ounces, they can just give me a $250 fine. I shouldn't be getting fined for something that I can legally go buy. Right. So that's a problem. And then if I have 4 ounces on me, which is, I believe, how much you can legally buy as a medical patient, I could be arrested.
Wow.
According to this bill. So there are still holes. And at the end of the day, I want to see cannabis completely decriminalized. I don't care if I have 5 pounds in the back of my car. At the end of the day, I think there has to be some policing that has to be done, but we have to see cannabis truly decriminalized. Like I said, this is a step 1, but it is not the end goal. We have not won totally yet with this bill.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up for me is, and any one of you can address this, as I'm listening, when we talk about the decriminalization and we talk about the ounces and how much you can have to get arrested and how much you can't have to get arrested. And then you just said, if I have up to 5 ounces, that's my business. How do we manage the line of an illegal distributor, and caution people around fentanyl, right? Because it is real that people sell marijuana with fentanyl in it. And how do we manage that part of it?
Lower the barriers to entry so that people will go out and open a legal business. They're not opening legal businesses because they can't, not because they don't want to. Mm-hmm. And at that point, that's different. If you could go, just like I could today decide I want to start a restaurant. Yeah, I'm going to have to go out and get a liquor license and all these things, but there's a pathway. There is literally no pathway for someone right now today that wants to get into cannabis in Maryland, except for buy a store.
Really?
You know, like there's no pathway. So, I mean, I think it's kind of simple, but I'll let, you know.
So Delegate Acevedo, is that coming down the pike after the passage of the legislation? Is a pathway to ownership, a legal ownership, an easier pathway to ownership? Is that the planning of that coming down the pike?
I'm not sure. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I think when we talk about things like fentanyl and just the more broader topic of drug policy, me personally, I think we should be responding to drug use, drug addiction, as a public health issue and not a criminal justice one. And so I see this issue a little bit differently, simply because I know and we've seen the beneficial impacts when we take a public health approach to this as opposed to a criminal justice one. And that's what we're saying when it comes to cannabis as well. Not just knowing the science, not just understanding the benefits of it, but recognizing that we are wasted and we have wasted billions of dollars enforcing this, incarcerating people. And, a lot of people say the war on drugs was a failure. I would argue that it was a success because the goal was to not just decimate communities of color. And by every measure, the war on drugs has been successful. So I'm not sure what folks mean when they say it's been a failure, because that's what the intent was, and it's been successful at that. But I'll also point out a couple of things real quickly. One is I do agree, because in 2014, a lot of us were fighting to decriminalize cannabis. I was in one of the first meetings on cannabis in the state of Maryland. I remember the conversation going quickly to cannabis legalization. And for a number of us, it was like, no, there's a social justice aspect of this, and we have to decriminalize cannabis first. A lot of us were pushing for up to an ounce. We did not decriminalize an ounce. And so that represents the unfinished work that we need to be looking at. And I'll also add drug paraphernalia and decriminalizing that, because that is also something that has been used as a premise to arrest folks, to stop them, etc. So it's still a lot of work that we need to do, but I would hope that we would see drug addiction and drug use as a public health issue and not a criminal justice one.
Amen. So I want to do this. Let's pivot and move now to audience questions. Why? Because we have a whole lot of them. Folk are really, really intrigued and engaged by this topic. I just want to again welcome anyone who's just joining us to the Collective Group's Town Hall on the legalization of cannabis in Maryland, question number 4. And our wonderful panelists that are with us, Delegate Acevedo, Kevin Ford, Hope Wiseman. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a joy to have this conversation with you. Let's dig into some questions. Y'all ready? Because there's a whole lot of them. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, Lakia says, hello, I am the co-principal in Green Space Accounting, which specializes in accounting for the cannabis industry. I'm wondering, how do I get involved in shaping the framework for a business to operate in Maryland? Do you have any recommendations for organizations, networks, events, government agencies to get involved and to help shape the process in Maryland? I'm going to throw this one to Hope and then to the delegate.
I was like, Kevin might be a good one for this, but
Kevin, y'all think Kevin?
I mean, I think there are a lot of awesome organizations in Maryland. I think you're doing the right thing, even being on this call right now. There's going to be a lot of movement come January. So if you want to get plugged in, I'd say like go to normal events, MPP, Uplift. I know we
What's MPP?
might be planning
Can we
something.
spell that out for
MPP,
someone?
Marijuana Policy Project. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I live in my little bubble where we all do the same thing. Sorry.
That's okay.
But I know Uplift is potentially planning something. I might be I might be talking too fast. But yeah, so Kev is good for this. Sorry.
Kev, you want to chime in? Answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few organizations, but I would say that depending on what you're actually advocating for is what you need to be worried about. You know, what are you really fighting for? Are you fighting for equity? I would say that Uplift is your absolute number one place that you need to be. Are you fighting for just economic opportunities broadly? You know, that might be a marijuana policy project. Are you fighting for increasing the level of home grow that we're able to do? Then you should be working with normal. So there's a few different organizations, but you know, of course, I have to plug the home team and say definitely reach out to me or Hope about Uplift.
Having said that, can you tell folk real quickly how they can reach out to Hope, to Uplift Maryland, please?
Absolutely. So I mean, you can go to our website, which is upliftmaryland.co. It's more so just a landing page for you to fill out and give us your information, and we'll be in contact with you shortly. And you can also follow us on Instagram at Uplift National.
Okay. Next question. What about Reverend Dr. Randall Rowell asked this question. What about preventive steps that will be taken to protect our communities from the abuse of cannabis? Who wants to take that?
I'll go. So public health is definitely, it hasn't gotten a lot of airtime in this conversation at all, but it's certainly something that the general public is worried about. And I would say that, you know, in terms of preventative steps, I would say that most of the General Assembly is asking the same exact question. And how do we, you know, take steps to protect our communities from the abuse of cannabis, and particularly within our adolescent age groups who are using cannabis and are at a greater exposure, I believe, to possibly getting that cannabis that you mentioned that might have fentanyl in it. You know, so I think, how do we give them the proper education they need to break down the stigma and allow them to understand what this plant actually is and what this industry is as a whole, so they change their perspective on their involvement.
Amen. Did anyone else want to address that? The protection piece? No. Okay.
I will say that I think a part of, we have to require the state to educate the public on this program. I think that's something that's missing from the medical program. And I've even seen in other states, they go above and beyond to educate the community. So I think we have to put more emphasis on that this time.
And I think this question kind of speaks to you saying that, Hope. Here's a question. It says, is there a difference between decriminalization and legalization of cannabis? If they are not the same, which one does question 4 address? Delegate, you want to go with that?
Yeah, sure. And that's a good question. Decriminalization deals with specifically the decriminalization of possession in certain amounts, which has always served as, again, as a pretext for stops, for arrests, for prosecutions. And that is something that we were pushing for in 2014 when I was involved in this fight. And before I came to the legislature, it was, how do we decriminalize and decriminalize up to an ounce of cannabis? And so that's important. And something can be decriminalized, but medical and recreational cannabis and that industry not be legalized. When we say legalized, we're talking about not just folks being able to operate in this industry legally, but that the government is then also able to, tax and, generate revenue and regulate, et cetera. And so there's a difference between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization addresses, in my opinion, more so the social and criminal justice aspects of this issue by ensuring that we're not continuing to arrest and put people through a criminal legal system for simple possession. And if there's any criminal defense lawyers on this call, that, simple possession and possession is really the bread and butter for a lot of attorneys. And so we've created this whole ecosystem around that. And so decriminalization addresses that, whereas legalization is about formally legalizing an industry where it is no longer an underground economy and the government is able to tax, to regulate, and to garner revenue.
Wow. Okay, another question, if legalized, will there be legislative barriers on who can provide and or sell recreational cannabis in Maryland?
Absolutely.
Yes. This bill does not mean that you can go out and sell anything at all.
In fact, if you do, it's 3 years and or $5,000 fine. So
Okay, so let's clarify this. Let's unpack this because that's a big deal. What does it actually do if it does not make it legal for and remove barriers for people to sell?
in my opinion, and I definitely applaud the efforts by the members of the General Assembly. However, this is glorified decriminalization. We are very far from legalizing this plant. They have really taken every step that they could to ensure that there is still some criminalization involved with cannabis legalization. And so to that point, it really is simply decriminalization. It is not legal, and it won't be legal even after this, although that's what we're saying that we're voting for. But HB 837 will tell you otherwise.
Go ahead, Delicate, I'm listening.
I mean, building on what Kevin said, and again, it's precisely why I voted against House Bill 837. I understand folks making these arguments, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But when we have an opportunity to get damn near perfect legislation and prioritize communities most impacted, and instead we decide to rush legislation and put an issue on the ballot. And let's be clear, yes, we're putting this issue to Marylanders to vote for, but there's a political expediency aspect of this here that we cannot ignore, right? Folks are coming out to vote. They're going to be voting for question 4, which enjoys a lot of support. But what that also means for us politically is that greater voter turnout means that, again, you have more candidates from a particular party. In this case, in Maryland, my political party that, would benefit from this. But I also think there's another piece of this, again, when it's being implemented, not immediately, but also there's some things that we need to address as it relates to cannabis legalization and as we're rolling it out, right? I talked about the fact that we hadn't figured out equity in licensure. Essentially what I said when I stood on the House floor and I voted against this bill was that we were going down the same road that we went, and that was my fear on medical cannabis. We're committing to communities that we're going to get this right. Just let us legalize it first. And then we're going to make sure that we're dealing with the equity and the disparity studies, et cetera, on the back end, when that it should be the priority and the focus right now. And ensuring that we're releasing people from prisons, not legalizing an industry while people are still in jail. And we're also finding out from industry, from folks who are already in there. I'm not sure if they have, but I'd be interested in finding out if folks have met with folks like Hope and other folks who are in this industry to find out how we can really build a system that would allow for this greater diversity rather than us trying to bake in diversity on the back end, which is what they tried to do with medical cannabis. You realize there was no diversity. So how do we, in essence, try to fix that? And diversity and equity is not something that you bake in on the back end. It's something that you prioritize on the front end.
Wow. Hope, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. I saw your hand, Kevin, or saw your finger. Did you have something you want to add?
I was just saying he's absolutely right.
Okay. All right. Next question. Those who are majorly opposed consider it for. Okay, good question. If question 4 doesn't pass, what happens next?
There's a very low probability of this.
That it won't pass.
I mean, we could talk about it, I guess.
It's someone's question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be a huge problem.
From the perspective. Oh,
yeah. Well, we've tried to introduce legislation for 3 or 4 years now around adult use legalization. So I think, this was kind of like a last resort almost. I think everyone was starting to get a little frustrated with just all this opposing legislation coming out. So it was kind of like, all right, just let the people decide. So if the people decide no, oh, that would just, I think, derail the whole ideology around how the General Assembly has been operating.
How confident are you all, the three of you, that people really understand what they're voting for?
0%.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd say like just like advocates, and only because we have to understand.
Okay, so
we've all gotten on calls together, and sometimes we unpack it and we're like, wait a minute, what exactly does that say? So I could imagine the average Marylander doesn't have any, they think that, they're legal, they're going to vote on November, and then like next day they're going to the dispensary. That's what they think. Oh, we're going to be coming to Marion, Maine. It's like, no, you won't. Probably for another year or two.
Right. It could take years for us to
Yeah.
have actual adult use dispensaries.
Okay, so I have a question here that makes me ask this question of Delegate Acevedo. Could you, in say 2 minutes, just unpack for us House Bill 1, House Bill 837, question 4? For those people on the call, for those people watching us streaming on Facebook who really don't understand, let's use this opportunity to make sure people understand what question 4 is so that they can vote most intelligently. Can you do that for us within 3 minutes?
I can try, but so let me say this first. A referendum is when the people decide whether a particular law or policy takes effect, right? And in order for a referendum to be on the ballot, so in other words, in order for you to see question 4 on the ballot, it means the legislature must not just introduce a constitutional amendment that would allow for this referendum, but the state legislature then writes what that referendum will look like on your ballot. So we are the people who are not just putting this referendum on the ballot, but we're also writing what you will see, what you will read before you make the determination whether you're voting for this or not. And so that's what we did in House Bill 1. We put, it was a constitutional amendment that creates a referendum that essentially says, very straightforward, do you think that adult recreational cannabis should be legal in Maryland? Of course, age stipulations, et cetera, but it's a very straightforward question that folks can vote, up or down, yes or no on. As far as House Bill 837, there's so much that makes up that bill, but there's so much that is not included in that bill. And so as I described it was a piece of legislation that really wasn't ready for prime time. And it was a piece of legislation that, in my opinion, did not center the communities most impacted. It's precisely why I introduced House Bill 1342, the Cannabis Legalization and Equity Act, that did a number of things, from not just releasing folks from prison to ensuring automatic expungement and going as far back as we can. I had someone who reached out to me who lived in Anne Arundel County and said that, I have had a charge since the 90s that I'm unable to get off of my record, right? It also decriminalizes paraphernalia. It allows for home growth. In fact, in my bill, we were pushing for 10 plants for home growth. It allows for investment. It allows for equity and licensure. And the whole purpose of me doing that is so that folks understand that, when we talk about model legislation and what we'd like to see, let's have a discussion with the communities most impacted. Those closest to the pain are closest to the solution, but seldom are they closest to power. And so if we are talking about cannabis legalization, how are we prioritizing Black voices in this space? How are we ensuring that whatever it is that we do, that Black people are able to get a fair shake, not just out of the criminal legal system, but out of this burgeoning industry? And that's my focus. 837 did not do that, in my opinion. It did not come anywhere close. And I made that clear. Some of my colleagues were not pleased with me because, we'd all like to go out there and tell people all these good things about legislation, but I'm all about being upfront and truthful. And if something don't benefit communities that look like me, I'm going to call it out, and I'm going to let folks know what it is that we still need to do.
Amen. Now, we do have to wrap up with our last final thought in terms of what our path forward is. But before I do that, I do have one more question that I want to get in, and I just want somebody to take just a minute to answer this. And the question is, what is the opposition to question 4 from those legislators who don't want this to pass? So you got 60 seconds, 30 to 60 seconds to answer that.
I mean, in my opinion, there really isn't much strong opposition. There aren't any funded political groups who are out here running TV ads or anything against the question. Most of the opposition that we've heard has really been from law enforcement saying, hey, you're stealing a tool in our policing toolkit for us to do our jobs. But we know how that has turned out in other instances across the country with innocent Black people being shot and killed who are unarmed and just minding their business. So, you know, I think that it's not really much strong opposition, to be honest with you. It's more so a question of how do we implement this once it's actually legalized? Which way do we go? Do we go in a way that is, you know, strictly capitalism based, or do we ensure that there's equity?
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Hope, 30 seconds. What's our path forward from here, sis?
We're gonna vote yes, and then we are gonna fight like hell to make sure that the legislation that comes out likely next year is equitable, truly. So, you know, that's the pathway forward at this point. That's where we have to go. We could look back at all the things we coulda, woulda, shoulda, but at this point, we got to vote yes for this legislation if we want to keep this alive, and then we got to fight to make sure that the legislation that talks about the tax revenue, licensure, and just community reinvestment, as well as the criminal justice, we can expand on the criminal justice reform than what's in the first House bill. What is it, 837? We can extend that. So
Gotcha.
we got to fight for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Delegate Acevedo, 30 seconds. What's the path forward from here, sir?
Well, first is we vote. If you haven't already, early voting has started. It's underway. Vote for question 4. And then secondly, go to mdelect.net. Type in your address and it will tell you who your state delegate states, really who your representatives are. Familiarize yourself with those people, because a lot of decisions are made in state capitals that you aren't paying attention to, and a majority of the issues that impact everyday Americans are actually decided at the state and not the federal level. So know who your state delegates and your state are, and who your state senator is. And then also follow me, follow my office, because equity, economic empowerment, and ensuring that reparative justice is prioritized is something that I'm going to be focusing on in the next session. And if folks are interested in being a part of this fight outside of the organizations that have been mentioned, feel free to reach out. And I don't know if are we going to allow at least 30 seconds wrapping up, because there's some folks.
That's what you're doing right now. That's your 30
Okay,
seconds.
well, no, I'm. Well, if that's the case,
you're in your 30
right.
seconds right now.
Well, if that's the case, I again, to the organizers, really thank you all very much. From Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated to Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated to Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, and of course, my sorors, the beautiful and amazing ladies of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Thank you all so much for just creating space so that we could have this conversation and educate our community.
All right. And listen, thank you everyone live streaming, joining us tonight. Thank you for joining the Collective Group's Town Hall on question 4. Thank you to our amazing panelists. You all were awesome. And it's been an honor to serve as moderator tonight. I hope you all be safe and get out and vote. Our vote matters. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. A special thank you to our moderator for facilitating this well-needed discussion. And also kudos to our panelist members for joining us during tonight's forum. Good evening, everyone. My name is Monique Brown, and I am the Secretary of the Anne Arundel County branch of the NAACP. The Collective Group would like to thank you all for joining us at tonight's forum. And also, we hope that tonight's discussion will give you some more information about question number 4. And our goal is that you walk away being more informed about that upcoming question on our election ballot. The collective group is comprised of the various groups here in Anne Arundel County, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women of Anne Arundel County, the Anne Arundel County branch of the NAACP, the Anne Arundel County chapter of Jack and Jill of America Incorporated, North Arundel County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Delta Pi Omega Chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Rho Eta Zeta Chapter of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, and Lambda Delta Sigma Chapter of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. And we also would like for you all to remember that your vote matters. The gubernatorial election is November 8th, and we encourage you to exercise your right to vote. It does make a difference. Also, don't forget, just as the delegate said, you can participate in early voting. You still have a couple more days left. You have tomorrow, November 2nd, and also Thursday, November 3rd. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Thank you all again, and you all have a great night.